Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a story that is just, well, it's as fascinating as it is absolutely heartbreaking. We're going to explore the incredibly well-documented, but ultimately tragic history of the heath hen. If you're here for a deep, focused look into how environmental history actually unfolds and how conservation science learns some of its absolute hardest lessons, you are definitely in the right place.
So I want you to just picture this for a second. Imagine a population of thousands of birds, slowly but surely ticking down over the decades. It's a literal countdown of an entire species going from total abundance to 100, then 50, 13, 3, until that countdown stops at exactly one. One single living individual, the absolute end of a biological line. Okay, let's dive into this, because as this quote perfectly captures, never in the history of ornithology has a species been watched in its normal environment down to the very last individual. We are looking at a completely unique, incredibly sad event in scientific history here. The extinction of the heath hen? It wasn't some mystery that happened out of sight in the shadows. It was meticulously observed, cataloged, and photographed right down to that very final bird. Which brings us to Section 1, the sole survivor. Let's head back to April 1, 1931. We're traveling over to James Green's farm on Martha's Vineyard, and there, completely isolated in the scrub oaks, is the last living heath hen on Earth. By all accounts, he was actually a really splendid, plump, well-groomed male. On this specific day in April 1931, he was out there braving a brutal, driving northeastern storm. And get this incredible bird had been completely alone without a single companion of his kind since December 8, 1928. He was an absolute master of evasion, just dodging predators and battling the elements entirely on his own. Now, to study this famous bird, Dr. Alfred O. Gross and his team had to take some incredible precautions. They used this delicate, totally harmless trap. It was basically just a simple iron frame covered with fish seine netting instead of harsh wire, just to make absolutely sure the bird wouldn't get injured. Once they captured him, they placed two little markers on him, an aluminum band on his left leg and a copper band on his right. And the reason they did this is pretty grim. It was so that if he were ever taken by a predator, like a hawk, his remains could be definitively identified. After that, he was released, completely unharmed, right back into the scrub oaks.
Now let's look at Section 2, a history of abundance, going from Maine to the Carolinas.
The really crucial thing to understand here is that the heath hen was not always just some rare island bird. Actually, scratch that. In early colonial times, they were completely abundant in favorable environments all the way from Maine down to the Carolinas. But they had this one specific behavioral trait. They absolutely loved congregating in wide-open fields. And unfortunately, that made them incredibly easy targets for early colonial market gunners. Because of that relentless hunting, the heath hen was entirely driven from the mainland by 1870. That restricted their final desperate stronghold strictly to Martha's Vineyard. Moving on to Section 3, the catastrophe of 1916, a devastating fire. So look at this timeline. In 1908, a reservation was established on the island. And the crazy thing is, those early conservation efforts actually worked at first. The population bounced back from under 100 to an estimated 2,000 birds. But then, May 12, 1916, a massive, devastating fire just swept across the entire breeding area. In a matter of hours, it destroyed their vital nesting cover and killed off so many nesting females. It completely undid years of progress right when the population was finally recovering. And from that fire, it was basically a straight, tragic line to 1928, where only one bird remained.
Following that fire and a sudden influx of predatory hawks, the population just crashed. You can see it right here. We hit that peak in 1916 with 2,000 birds. Then, jumped to 1922, and we are looking at a mere 117 birds. By 1927, just 13 birds are left, and only 2 of those were females. It's just a dramatic, totally unstoppable countdown of a collapsing population.
Which leads into Section 4, desperate measures, the chain of demise.
You see, it wasn't just the 1916 fire that caused this. The fire started a chain reaction, a chain of demise. First, it skewed the population, leaving way too many males. Because of this abnormal sex ratio, those excess males relentlessly harassed the few remaining females, doing irreparable damage during the breeding season. On top of that, having such a tiny population led to excessive interbreeding, which caused declining sexual vigor and genetic sterility. But honestly, perhaps the most tragic blow of all was disease. Some well-intentioned people introduced domestic turkeys to the island, and well, those turkeys brought a fatal poultry disease called blackhead. The native heath hens fed in those exact same fields caught the disease and died off in huge numbers.
Now here's a really fascinating scientific distinction that usually surprises people. The eastern heath hen, the one that went extinct in the wild and was so highly sensitive to its environment, was actually the exact same species as the western prairie chicken, which was super abundant over in the Midwest. Scientists eventually figured out they were just geographical races of the same species, separated a long time ago by geography. But despite them being the same species, all attempts to bring the hardy western prairie chicken out east as a replacement or to breed the heath hen in captivity, total failures, every single time.
And that brings us to Section 5, the final booming, a solitary survivor.
True to the deep-seated traditions of his race, this lone male returned to his ancestral booming field on the green farm with unfailing regularity. Every single day, at dawn and dusk, he would step out of the scrub oaks. He was highly wary, constantly alert for marshhawks, literally ready to duck into the grass at a moment's notice. He was out there doing exactly what his ancestors had done for centuries.
And this leads to what is probably the most poignant, heartbreaking detail in our entire explainer. Completely bereft of companions, this lone male flew to the top of an oak tree to perform his nuptial dance. Now, ground birds like the heath hen normally perform this out on an open field, but entirely alone, he flew up into the branches. Up there, he erected his tail, threw his pinnet feathers forward, and inflated his bright orange vocal sacs to boom. He was performing the ancient, instinctive courtship dance of his species, calling out with everything he had to an audience that simply didn't exist anymore.
Let's wrap up with Section 6, Legacy for Conservation, a permanent warning. We transition here from a living, breathing survivor, braving those wild Massachusetts storms, to a preserved taxidermy museum specimen. The death of that single, solitary male on Martha's Vineyard meant the undeniable death of his entire race. It's a very stark visual reminder that once a species is gone, it is gone forever. There is no coming back.
Which leaves us with a really critical question to chew on. The state of Massachusetts and various organizations spent over $70,000, which, by the way, was a massive sum of money back then, and they expended totally unprecedented effort to save this bird. But they still failed. So if $70,000 and unprecedented efforts couldn't save the heath hen, what must we change to protect today's vulnerable species? The story of the heath hen serves as a permanent warning. It tells us that conservation absolutely must be proactive, not reactive. You can't just throw money at a critically collapsed population and expect to overcome the brutal math of disease, habitat loss, and genetics. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and I'll see you next time.